Welcome back to Yoga Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Waycott. If you're new to the podcast, this show is a space for yoga teachers who are looking for a modern and grounded approach to navigating the yoga industry. I've been teaching yoga for the past 14 years, and every week I share insights and reflections to help you keep your work feeling inspired and sustainable. In today's episode, I'm sharing a brief personal check-in about how I was recently affected by some flooding that took place here in southern British Columbia, and how that experience offered me a really timely lesson in acceptance. I'm also diving into a topic today that comes up a lot for yoga teachers, which is collecting feedback and testimonials. We'll talk about why feedback is such an important long-term practice for independent yoga teachers, and when it's appropriate for us to take certain kinds of feedback with a grain of salt. I'm also going to share how I personally use feedback to improve my own teaching and how I collect it in my classes and from my training programs, and how you can use feedback to identify areas of growth for yourself, as well as identify what your strengths are as a teacher. Now, before we get started, and while I'm on the theme of talking about feedback, if you have been enjoying Yoga Insider Podcast as a free resource and these conversations have been helpful for you, I would really appreciate it if you would take a moment to leave a review for the podcast wherever you've been listening, or share the podcast on your social media or share it with another yoga teacher. It really helps the work that I do reach more people, and it's such a simple thing that you can do to support my work in a meaningful way. So let's get into today's episode. I want to start today's episode with a little bit of a check-in and kind of explain what's been happening over the past few days. So this past week, I was affected by some pretty significant flooding that came up in Washington State, actually, which I live super close to Washington State. And it affected those of us who live here in southern British Columbia, just north of the US border. So what happened was I went out the other night to teach my yoga classes, and I had a feeling that the main road that I travel on to get to my classes might be affected by the flood that was kind of like making its way into my area. And the reason that I had a feeling that this was going to happen was because I was affected by an even larger flood that took place here about 4 years ago. So when you've been through it before, you kind of get a sense of like the pace of these things and how they go. But I wasn't sure, like, if the road was actually going to close or if I was maybe just being like a little bit too cautious. I think also because the last flood was a bit more like traumatic for people. It was bigger. A lot of people, had significant damage to their homes. There was so much livestock that was sadly killed. Because like all the cows drowned in the flood and stuff like that. Like it was really traumatic for people. So I actually couldn't quite tell if I was like just overthinking and over preparing. But anyways, I decided that like even if the road was going to close, I was still going to go teach my yoga classes because I am committed to the bit. And if you know me, I'm actually super stubborn as well. It is one of my faults, unfortunately. I'm a Taurus. So I was like, I'm just going to go teach my yoga classes anyway. I went out, I taught my classes. I did pack an overnight bag with me, like just in case the roads did close or the flooding got worse. And then sure enough, by the time my late class was finished, I read the notification from the local police department that the road was closed and covered in water, and I couldn't get home. So thankfully, I was able to spend the night at my mom's house. She lives close by to the spot where I teach my classes, or where I was teaching that night. And in reality, like, everything was fine. Like, I was safe. My loved ones were safe. my home is well above sea level. Like, I didn't have water damage in my home or anything like that. I wasn't personally impacted by the water, but it did end up becoming this big lesson in acceptance, just because I wasn't expecting to spend what turned into 3 days staying at my mom's house, without a lot of my stuff, without my computer. And just to be real with you, like, there were things that I wanted to do. There were things that I felt like I needed to do. There was work that I wanted to get done, even though, like, it didn't make a huge difference whether I did the work, 3 days later. But sometimes, we create these timelines in our minds, right? And it was like I just had to accept and surrender to the fact that those things needed to be on pause. I didn't know exactly what day I was going to make it home. And I also didn't know if I was going to be able to put out a podcast this week because if that main road didn't reopen, like, my podcast equipment is at my house. I've got everything set up at my house, to produce Yoga Insider. And I was like, I had already accepted basically that I was just going to lose my streak of podcasting every week. And that is something that I feel proud of, like, that I've been able to deliver on the podcast and show up every week, like, despite life happening. And if you look at the statistics for podcasts, like, most podcasts don't make it past the third episode. And I think it's over 90% of podcasts that are out there, like, in the world, haven't produced, like, an updated episode in the past 3 months. So there's a lot of work that goes into showing up every week to make a podcast. And I had already come to the place of accepting that I wasn't going to be able to produce an episode on time this week. But thankfully, like, the road did reopen and I was able to get home last night. So hopefully you'll be hearing this podcast on time. But what was really sweet in the midst of all of this is that some of my yoga teacher friends kind of came to the rescue, and we went and, like, checked out some local shops and we went for coffee. And I did have quite a few people message me and offer to take me out for coffee, or they're like, can I take you for lunch? Can I buy you lunch? Like, it was really, really kind. And I truly felt supported, even though, again, like, I was not actually being deeply affected by this flood in terms of loss of possessions or anything like that. It was just a little wrench in my plans, and it certainly wasn't how I thought my week would go. I wasn't anticipating living through a flood. And I think for those of us who live in British Columbia as well, like, we tend to have more mild weather here. We don't have a ton of extreme weather events like other places in North America. Like, we don't get hurricanes, we don't get tornadoes, knock on wood. So maybe these things do feel a little bit more extreme for us just because we're not used to them. But this whole experience the past few days has definitely made me reflect on just, like, support in general in a broader sense, and how important it is to have people who show up for you when you need it, and to have people around you whose input you actually trust. And that is kind of a perfect segue into today's episode, which is about asking for feedback and asking for testimonials. So I'm going to talk about collecting feedback and testimonials and how to use them to your advantage, and also when to take feedback with a grain of salt. Now, every year around December or around the end of the calendar year, I send out a feedback form in my monthly email newsletter. And this form is specifically for the students who attend my weekly pre-registered yoga classes, because those students and those classes are just so fundamental to the work that I do. These are people who I see every single week, all throughout the year. And yeah, I see the same people. Like, month after month. So I ask them for feedback once a year, and I will get into kind of my system for doing that. But reflecting on this always makes me think about feedback more broadly and just how important it is for us as yoga teachers. I don't think it's something that gets like enough attention. And years ago, I don't even know how long ago this was at this point. It was very early in my teaching career. I was like a model or like demo student for an on-demand yoga website. And it was kind of like one of the first of its kind. I don't even think that they had like a mobile app back then. It was like you literally had to log in on your computer to their website. And they used to bring in yoga teachers from all over the place to film yoga classes. And I think a lot of the filming took place near Vancouver, Canada, or like in Vancouver, Canada. And sometimes they would put a call out for like demo students to be in their videos so that the teacher who was being featured in the video could actually teach, right? So they would have a student there who's like doing the practice and doing the asanas, and then the teacher is like sitting next to them, explaining things, and it was really great. So I actually knew the person who was like running the website, I guess, at the time, and she had put a call out for models, and I was this super eager young new yoga teacher, and I was like, I want to do it. And so I went to go do the filming in Vancouver, and they were filming in this beautiful old building that had like these brick walls inside. It used to be called the Vancouver School of Bodywork and Massage. I don't think it exists anymore. And then I think eventually it became Vancouver School of Healing Arts, and then I think they moved to a different location. But I just remember, like, when I met the yoga teacher that I was going to be working with that day, so the teacher that they were featuring in their video, he was super kind. He was super enthusiastic about me being a new yoga teacher and how exciting it was that I was starting this journey. And I remember so vividly him saying, Alex, if you don't mind, I want to give you a piece of advice, like, coming from a place of experience. And it's this: if you want to grow as a yoga teacher, it is very important to have people in your life who are willing to give you real feedback on your teaching. And that has always stuck out to me. I have always remembered and kind of gone back to those words of wisdom, because it was the first time I'd really heard that before. And I do think about it every year when I collect feedback of like how important this is to hear, the input of other people so that we don't end up like living in a vacuum. So I have a pretty clear process for collecting feedback every year. I like to create a Google form that people can fill out on their own. And if you're deciding to do this, by all means, use whatever type of form makes sense to you. There might even be integrations like in the software that you're already using. But I make a Google form. And in that form that I put into my newsletter, I usually ask a combination of questions. So there's going to be some specific practical questions that I'll ask. And these are things like, how is the time of day that classes take place? Like, how's that time working for you? I might ask things like, is there a different style or type of class that you'd like to see on the schedule? Is there a certain time slot that you feel is missing that you'd like to see on the schedule? I'm also asking questions like, why do you come to class every week? Because I'm curious about people's motivations, and I think that information is really interesting. And then there's usually a section at the end of the feedback form where people can share a testimonial about the impact that the classes are having on them. So that way they can talk a little bit more about their personal experience. And I do think it's important to differentiate between asking for feedback on something specific and then like asking for a testimonial that is perhaps based more on that individual's experience, but can certainly serve as like inspiration for other people who may have not been in your class before, but might like to hear what it's like to be in your class. So just remembering that like feedback and testimonials are slightly different things. And when people are choosing to fill out that form, they are signing off with the understanding that their testimonial might be used to promote future classes as social proof. So they might see their own testimonial on my website, my social media, in my newsletters, and it's kind of like, hey, people are actually coming to these classes. This is what their experience has been like, and maybe that's going to inspire somebody else to come join the classes as well. So I think, when you are collecting feedback from people, like just make it super clear as well that like you might be using the feedback and, do you have permission to use their name or their initial or whatever. And I think what's worth noting is that this year, I actually only asked for testimonials when it comes to my pre-registered classes. I did not ask specific feedback questions like I have in the past. And I actually didn't leave any room to ask feedback questions. And this is not coming from a place of being beyond feedback because, like, obviously I'm making a whole podcast episode about feedback and, like, I will continue to ask for feedback. But right now, my pre-registered class schedule is how I like it. I'm probably not going to add more pre-registered classes to my schedule. And at the end of the day, like I've been doing this long enough that people's behavior is giving me the feedback that I need. So when I look at my classes, like student retention is super high. Attendance is great. Classes are full. The same people are showing up over and over again, month after month, year after year. And all of that tells me that things are in a pretty good place right now. And I'm not looking to make any significant changes at the moment. So it doesn't mean that I won't make changes eventually. It doesn't mean that I am not going to ask for feedback again. But I was just in a place this year where I was like, I just don't have any feedback questions for the students who are coming. But if they want to leave a testimonial, by all means. And something that's pretty important to me ethically, and these are just like my personal ethical standards that I hold for myself, is that I never bribe people for testimonials. And the reason that I want to point this out, and not to throw any shade, but it is like a business practice that I observe among other businesses and like other industries as well. Like I'm not even talking about the yoga industry specifically, but I don't personally ever offer prizes or giveaways or discounts like as a reward for sharing feedback. I think that if somebody is going to share feedback, they need to do it because they want to. They need to do it because they feel compelled to share it out of their own free will and not just because they're trying to win something. So that is where I personally draw the line. And that's just what feels good for me in my business, is knowing that that feedback that comes through is genuine and people chose to share it and there was not a prize for them to give it to me. So, if you are going through the process of collecting feedback from people, like you have to decide for yourself how you're going to do that and what feels right for you and what feels aligned for you. And I think especially for independent yoga teachers, asking for feedback can be a really important part of your long-term strategy. And like I ask for feedback every single year as part of my pre-registered classes. And I also ask for feedback after every training and every continuing education module that I run. Like whenever that weekend wraps up or that training wraps up, I'm always sending out, a final email with with a link to a feedback form, right? So that hopefully I can continue to grow and make improvements. But we do need to be discerning about, sorry, Waylon, I just poked Waylon in the eye underneath my desk. We need to be discerning about what or when we ask for feedback and what we ask for feedback on. Because one thing that I want to like drill in so clearly here is that a lot of people don't know how to give feedback well. And I'm going to say it one more time. A lot of people don't know how to give feedback well. Giving feedback is a skill, and sometimes we need to guide people as yoga teachers by asking better questions and by asking more specific questions. So what I've noticed is that there is feedback sometimes that shows up without your consent. So this is feedback that you didn't ask for. And I see this come up a lot online for yoga teachers who work in those bigger, more corporate settings. So like big studios or big like franchise gyms that have locations all over the world. And a lot of times those spaces are using booking software that like really encourages feedback from the users and the students who are booking in. It also shows up a lot if you are teaching in a space that uses ClassPass. For some reason, ClassPass reviews are like notoriously awful. I hope it's okay to say that. But just from personal experience and like listening to other yoga teachers, that kind of feedback isn't always helpful. And sometimes that kind of like unsolicited feedback can really mess with your mind. So you will get comments that have absolutely nothing to do with your skill as a yoga teacher. And it's usually comments that are based more on like that person's preferences. And again, I see this like not just in the yoga industry, but like just in like the fitness industry as a whole. I hear Pilates teachers talking about this. I hear spin instructors talking about this, and how sometimes it gets to the point where like you just have to stop reading reviews altogether because they're really damaging to like how you feel about yourself. And so sometimes you'll get comments, within this like unsolicited feedback that somebody's saying that they hated the music that you played in class and it put them in a bad mood. And that's not really about your teaching. And it's not that like we don't want to take these preferential pieces of feedback into consideration, but we have to decide like, is this something that I want to let hold a lot of weight? Do I want to let this affect me? Or is this just kind of a random one-off thing that's like more about the person who wrote the review or wrote the feedback than it actually is about you or your classes, right? So like, I don't like the music. It put me in a bad mood. Somebody's yoga mat was stinky and I could smell it next to me, or the person next to me was breathing too loud, like those kinds of things. And so like, if you are receiving feedback like that, it's again, like not that you want to ignore it completely, because sometimes it does bring things to your attention that you weren't aware of. And maybe you need to have a conversation with somebody about like cleaning their yoga mat or whatever. But you need to decide whether the feedback is actually useful for you or whether it's something that you just need to take with a grain of salt. So I think it is important to talk about what you should actually do with feedback when you receive it, because if you are just collecting feedback and then like letting it sit in a folder on your computer, then it's probably not really serving anyone or helping anyone. So the value that you are going to receive from feedback is going to come from how you interpret it and then how you choose to allow it or maybe not allow it to inform your work like moving forward. And hopefully you're doing that without allowing feedback to like completely destabilize you or throw you off. So the first thing that I always do when I am reviewing feedback is I like to look for patterns that show up. So I'm not really concerned about those one-off isolated comments. I'm not really concerned about feedback that's just about somebody's personal experience and their preferences and like their likes and their dislikes. Um, I'm looking into the feedback and I'm asking myself, like, what kinds of things am I hearing repeatedly over and over again? What keeps coming up consistently across different students, and what's showing up also across different programs or different offerings that I have? Like, is there a theme that shows up over and over? Um, and a lot of times these patterns will point towards your strengths, which is really exciting. So you might notice that people are consistently mentioning clarity. They might be consistently mentioning that they feel really supported or really like nurtured or seen by you. Maybe they really appreciate the way that you sequence your classes. So like make note of what those little patterns are, because if there are multiple people who are naming the same thing, that's really important information. And that's often an indicator of something that you are doing really well, and maybe something that deserves to be acknowledged more. Now, the patterns that you see in your feedback can also point towards potential areas of growth. So, if you notice that similar questions are coming up from people over and over again, where like they're not quite clear on something, or maybe you are receiving requests for an explanation in like a certain area, that might mean that there's an opportunity to like refine or get more clear on something. And it might not even be in terms of your teaching skills specifically. It could come down to like the way that you're marketing online. Like maybe people don't know when your classes are. Or maybe people don't know where you teach, right? And you're getting asked these same questions all the time. Like that could be an indicator that you need to share your schedule more clearly, or you need to share like the types of classes that you teach more clearly. So pay attention to those things as well. If the feedback is indicative of like gaps, in communication, or again, maybe in specific skills as well. And then another really important skill is learning to separate the feedback that comes through about your teaching from feedback that is rooted in someone's personal preference, because I really think that those are two different things, and they don't necessarily carry the same weight. So skill-based feedback is probably going to sound like, your cues are so clear that I can practice with my eyes closed, and it makes me feel so present when I'm in your class. And yes, there is an experiential element where your student is saying like they feel present and they're talking about their own experience, but they're being clear because they're saying it's because your cues are so clear, right? And that relates to your skills as a teacher. It might be something like the progressions in your class, excuse me, make a lot of sense. They led me towards exploring a pose that I didn't feel ready to try until now, because you took me there safely in a way that was progressive and made sense. Like something like that is going to really relate to your skills. Whereas preference-based feedback is going to sound like, I don't like the music. I prefer a faster class. I prefer a slower class. I wish that you taught more like this other teacher. Or I like this class better when so-and-so teaches it and when we don't have a sub. Like those are preferential. And preference-based feedback isn't useless, but it doesn't have to carry the same weight as the feedback that is about your skills. And it's important to remember that your job as a yoga teacher is not to meet everyone's personal preferences. It's to teach well, and it's to teach with integrity. So if I'm not someone's cup of tea, no problem. There are so many wonderful teachers out there and people who teach completely differently than I do. And hopefully they will continue to go out and like explore other classes and other teachers and find someone that they resonate with and who does fit like their personal preferences as well. And that's just totally natural for us to prefer different types of teachers and different types of classes. So I think that just really for independent yoga teachers, like testimonials can be especially important for you. And when you get them, you don't want to just let them sit in a folder on your computer and like forget about them till the next year. You want to make sure that you're actually sharing them. You want to put your testimonials on your website. You can share them in your monthly email newsletters. You can share them on social media. You can share them on like sign up pages or registration pages for events or trainings that you're running. And when you share this, it's really to help people understand what it's like to be in the room with you, because they're not going to know unless they've taken your class before. And if you teach independently and you don't have a big studio or a big like corporation behind you, where you are kind of leaning on their reputation, right? Your students' words and your students' testimonials are going to help tell the story for other people. So I think if you're doing things on your own, you definitely want to try to get some good quality testimonials. I recommend asking people who've been coming to your classes for a long time. And like, obviously, don't get your mom to write a testimonial. Don't ask your best friends to write a testimonial and put them on your website. We can always tell, and it doesn't look authentic. So if you are an independent yoga teacher and like you don't have someone there sitting in on your classes and giving you feedback on them, you don't have some kind of like annual review system that you can go through, there isn't any sort of system created for you to offer like feedback and reflection unless you create it. So when you make a habit of asking for feedback, it is going to help you get some data and some information about the way that you teach so that you're not making assumptions, and so that you're not blind to like what your strengths are and what draws people to your classes, because sometimes we have a hard time seeing those parts of ourselves too. And so it might highlight your strengths and it might highlight areas for growth additionally that like you weren't aware of. It's also going to help you develop your discernment. So when you are asking for feedback on a regular basis and you're actually inviting it in a way that's structured, like, you know, once a year or a couple times a year, you're like putting it in your newsletter, you're asking specific questions. I think that it's kind of like training a muscle, right? And with practice, it does get a little bit easier to kind of sift through feedback, because every yoga teacher knows that like maybe it's like the first time you get kind of like a bad review, right? That can like totally throw you off and you probably remember it and it was probably upsetting. And I just think like when we kind of train that muscle and we get into the practice of receiving feedback consistently and like asking for feedback consistently, you do become less reactive over time to feedback that maybe isn't so great or feedback that was uninvited and was not consensual. And over time, you do start to trust yourself more, right? Like you have a clear, grounded understanding and knowledge of like the way that you teach that's grounded in reality. So when feedback is integrated really intentionally and like you're asking for feedback intentionally, it does give you clarity and it helps you see yourself and the work that you do more clearly. It helps you name your strengths, and like continue to grow. So before I wrap up today's episode, I will take a moment just to kind of tie everything together that we've talked about today so far. So there are a lot of aspects of teaching yoga that can cause us to feel a sense of uncertainty, especially when it comes to our skills, as well as our innate desire just to be liked by others. And I think that this journey of like being a yoga teacher and always growing and improving is a lot easier when you are supported by the right people and the right community, and when you have people in your corner whose input you value and people who you can ask for feedback. I think that's really important. So in today's episode, we talked about feedback as a long-term professional practice, especially for independent yoga teachers. And you do want to get into the habit of asking for feedback. And you want to let this be a way to invite feedback intentionally by asking better questions that are actually going to support your growth too. So we have to kind of guide the feedback to an extent and know that like not everybody has the skill of giving feedback in a way that is constructive and helpful to you and your growth as a teacher and not just rooted in their personal preferences. Okay, so we can kind of mitigate that issue by asking better questions. We explored the importance of discernment. So try to identify patterns that show up in your feedback, learn to separate skill-based feedback from personal preference, and understand that not all feedback has to be accepted. So at the end of the day, you are going to decide what feedback you choose to accept, what feedback you don't, what feedback you take with a grain of salt, what feedback is like super high priority, and maybe you do want to make changes or implement some kind of change immediately because of it. And maybe there's feedback that you just kind of put in the back of your mind, but you're like, that's not really at the top of the list. And finally, we talked about how sharing testimonials is a way to help other people understand what it is like to practice with you and what it's like to be in the room with you. So my hope is that today's little episode is encouraging, and I hope that it encourages you to engage with feedback in a way that feels grounded and ethical. And if you haven't asked your students for feedback before, like, don't be afraid to start, right? Make a form, put it in your next newsletter, and start to get into that practice. So thank you so much for listening to another episode of Yoga Insider Podcast. If this episode resonates with you, feel free to share it with a yoga teacher who might need it, or leave a review to support the podcast. I'll see you next time. Thanks.